and welcome to episode 8 of the Airport Communities Podcast. I am your host for today, J.C. Harris. We got a marketing email a couple of days ago saying that we have already created more podcast episodes than most podcasters. I'm like 8. But it is a fact that each week we are getting more downloads than the week before. So thank you. We continue to get letters about the second airport thing. People objected to my use of the word bullshit, profanity, I suppose. But we do have a bullshit meter, which has become something of common parlance in academia and engineering in evaluating research studies, because there are so many junk papers, and that's just become a term of art. The second airport fallacy, it's 10 out of 10 on the bullshit meter, because not only is the notion that a second airport would ever somehow draw off capacity, not only is that not true, the port, the FAA, tell you it's not true. So if everybody's telling you something is not true and you still believe it, you're in flat earther territory. Another one that kind of comes on the radar from time to time, people will believe that we deserve better, but a surprising number of people will tell us that they're worried that the port may not be able to afford it. Port will talk about all of the billions they have to spend to expand the airport, and then you'll see stories in the papers about tariffs, and commissioners will go on TV and they'll say, "I stay up nights worrying about cargo." I'm like, do you really? The fact that people are genuinely concerned, like, can they afford it? Because if you look at like other local governments, you rarely hear people go, "Gee, can my city really afford to do the right thing on such and such?" It's like, no, they just, just do it, right? But people do have this sort of special feeling about the port like I say, it's just like, wow. But it's rubbish. We get comments from people who will say, "Hey, just give it to me in 25 words or less." And okay, fine. The port is doing the best of any agency in the state. There. We've said this before, but what we've noticed is that when we try to do that, keep it snappy, it comes off as unsatisfying. People do need the explainer. Normally I come in and just read down a script, but just for this one episode, I asked my colleagues to indulge me in preparing this week's episode. I had this friend in college who went on to a very successful career as a magician in Vegas. Even back when, we were 18, 19, a lot of his jokes were based on this cartoonist named Rube Goldberg. And I'm going out on a limb here, but the port got started in 1911, about the same year as Rube Goldberg cartoons. Boy, this is a stretch. Anyhow, just hang in there. These were cartoons that were mechanical contraptions, and essentially the same joke over and over. They're overly complicated, they're nonsensical, there are really long explanations, and then at the end, the punchline is that the solution is some obvious thing that didn't need any of that junk in order to do its thing. Now, my friend the magician's shtick was much like that. He would start by telling people the punchline of the joke, and he would further tell them that everything he was about to do was a complete waste of time. But he hoped it would be captivating and so on, and then he would do the stupidly obvious punchline. It was a lot more hysterical than this sounds to me so far. But that's essentially what we're going to do. We're going to dive in a bit deeper on the port's finances, and I hope you enjoy it, because at the end, you're going to see why none of it matters. But it won't make sense if I give you the punchline now. Now, if you've actually lived around here a while, long enough to recall the third runway, The port was not historically always performing as well as it is now. In fact, going back to 1911, there would be a scandal pretty much every 5 or 10 years and constant discussions of why the port was underperforming, mismanaged, and corrupt. That really was the ongoing joke, and the third runway was no exception. There were multiple scandals, 400% cost overruns. There was an investigation conducted by the former U.S. District Attorney, firing of the longtime director, and then a few years later, the firing of another director, and the ship started turning around 2010. The port has the equivalent of a reserve fund, they'll get mad at me, but call it a rainy day fund, of between 15 and 18 months. Even if a catastrophe happened, they could keep rolling right along in a way that cities maintain, 2 months, the state of Washington, a few months, 6 months if you're super fortunate, not 18 months. We did have a disaster scenario, if you recall, just a couple of years ago, even though it seems like 300. It was called COVID. And it was a situation where everybody got some of that ARPA money, remember? And the port was no exception. They got $200 million to address bond payments. So they had absolutely no problem paying off debt. They didn't need the money to keep the lights on. Their primary interest was keeping their creditors calm and happy, because unlike cities, they have to keep borrowing every year. So even when disaster struck, as with the giant banks during the 2008, whatever they call that, the government swoops in and takes care of them. And the creditors see that and they go, oh, okay, nothing to worry about here. That's too big to fail. And then somebody might say, well, if you're really not careful and we don't accommodate growth and all that stuff, maybe Alaska Airlines or, one of the big anchor carriers will just jump ship. Where would they go? You're assuming that there's some, capacity anywhere. What other system has the built-out plumbing, the thousands of subcontractors and logistics companies and so on? Remember episode 6 where we talked about how Southwest Airline was considering moving only 85 flights a day over to King County International Airport? Alaska was the most prominent public testifier against. They did not want the county to allow Southwest to move over there. Why? Well, because then the remaining tenants would have to pay more. Airport is a series of contracts. Some are individual, but some of them are more like an HOA. And you all share the same costs. And if, you have a couple of people leave, that means others have to pay. So when people are worried about, accommodating growth and so forth, it's like, no, the airlines will tell you when they can't accommodate any more growth. Because there is so much more theoretical capacity, the theoretical capacity of the airport in the airspace is 90 an hour, according to the FAA. Let's do some simple math, 90 times 24. That's what the current technology could accommodate. Why doesn't that happen? Well, supply and demand. When you notice these big backups at 6 in the evenings and 10 in the morning or what have you, it is the free market in action. You need to have somebody in St. Louis who wants to send a flight over here, and you want to have somebody over here who wants to send a flight over to Hawaii, and there are certain times a day where all of that comes together. And then there are going to be these gaps. You're not going to just lean on Delta to find some flight to Bermuda, I guess, at 3 in the afternoon. No, people want to fly when they want to fly. And so the market is one of the big limiting factors, not the airspace. Getting back to the debt, all debt is not created equally. You may have a first mortgage. on your house. And then you may also have a second mortgage, because you wanted to build that added bathroom thing, right? To you, they're all the same in the sense that you got to pay both. And it's the same sort of for the port. They got to pay all their creditors, first, second, third. But that's not how it looks to creditors. So you've got a house and a job, okay? But you have one big form of collateral. The port being this quasi-governmental, federal business thing, there's truly nothing else like it, flips that on its head. Not only do they have many more sources of revenue than you do, imagine what it would be like if the primary determinant of your creditworthiness was that home improvement loan and not the much larger assets and collateral and your job, if those were all just sort of taken as secondary. It's a very different way of thinking about debt. On $1 billion in overall revenue and $323 net airport revenue, the first lien debt, what you would call your first mortgage, the debt service is only about $44 million a year. So it's this crazy high ratio of 8-to-1, meaning they can cover that debt in an emergency almost for years and years. And there are the second mortgages and the third mortgages, which also have to be repaid, and they're actually a lot more than the first lien, but the collateral against those are based on airline revenues, and they can be renegotiated like almost every year. They have contracts, but they're flexible. And here's a little acronym to keep in mind, CPE, cost per employment. That is what keeps the airlines happy. You know how we talked about the airport being a parking lot? What airlines care about is that our parking lot remain vaguely competitive with other airports. And we're always around 70, 72. We're not the lowest, we're not the bargain rate, but we're not anywhere near the highest. And we don't want to be the cheapest because we want to present a quality experience, both for the airlines and for passengers. Yeah, I don't know because I'm old, but what would that be? Would that be like Acura or Nordstrom's? It's not a Rolls Royce, but it's not a dollar store either. That gives you enough money, if you keep it around 70 or so, to keep going with that second and third debt forever. Now, there is a unique contract, as I said, between the major airlines here, Delta, Alaska, and that's called a signatory agreement. And again, there is a group agreement for, general stuff, takeoffs and landings and so forth. I don't want to make it out like you can arbitrarily just raise and lower prices. These are contracts, but every year the airport performs an audit, and if there have been undercharges, then they adjust the various fees accordingly, and if there are overcharges, then they provide refunds. But that is part of your contract for using the parking lot, that you will accommodate any of the approved projects like the SAMP. One advantage of being a signatory is that you get a say-so in the planning, but everybody pays to keep that CPE where it needs to be. And then there are these government grants that you may have heard about called passenger facilities charges, which is $450 tacked on to every ticket. The port has to name the projects they want to use that for, but they're grabbing that money out of every ticket and can bank it and draw down on it on individual capital projects as needed. So they have all of these tools, half a dozen tools, that they can balance back and forth, and that keeps that cost per employment solid. And then, okay, you've been dancing around it for a while, but what is their annual debt service overall? Well, it's about a third of their budget in any given year. It's constantly churning every year. It's building stuff. Not stuff for the SAMP. Things don't seem like they have to do with capacity, but they really are. A new baggage system and facial recognition stuff and anything that gets people through the airport faster. That's adding capacity. So they're constantly renovating, they're renovating their city. And you go, wow, they're spending a third of their income on debt. Well, most people who are homeowners spend about that much, and you're not too worried about it. Remember we talked about COVID a few minutes ago, and we said that the money was a lot of bond payments and so forth. Airport operations dropped by half. And yes, you'd have the port commissioners on TV, and they would be bemoaning the future of the airport. Well, if it were a city, they would, because it's an emergency, they would devote a lot of that just to keeping the lights on and maybe even paying some salaries and so on. But 2 years after the end of the pandemic, and they're not only back to record operations, they're just as financially healthy as ever. So any worries you might have had about their situation should have been assuaged just by that. Businesses that really got slammed, human beings that really got slammed during COVID, don't bounce back that quickly. The amount of money it takes to keep the lights on, even with operations down 50%, and lastly, gosh, it's so small in the big picture. If you are fortunate enough to be a property owner in King County, it is the one direct form of support you provide to this system, and that is, of course, the property tax levy. This year, it's maybe $88 million. They have a limit, which is more like 130. They never get close to that because it would, look bad. It averages around $79 per King County taxpayer. It's a bit less for us because, well, our homes are worth less. They have a couple of superpowers. First of all, nobody ever gets to vote on it. And second of all, it's extremely flexible. It's not used directly on the airport. When you're doing well, you keep those things separate. But in a pinch, you could take some of the tax levy and put it towards the airport. It's a signal of how well the port is doing that they haven't had to dip into the property tax levy for airport projects for over a decade. When you could tell that things were kind of getting dodgy is during the third runway, because that's the last time they did it. But what they do with 40, sometimes 50% of it, is to use it to pay off other types of general purpose bond debt. Think of it how you can, if you're fortunate enough, double up on your mortgage payments. It is stunning how much money they have been able to save themselves over the years just by accelerating, just by putting $30 or $40 million a year, just $30 or $40 million a year into bond repayments. It ends up being hundreds of millions over time. And they have a little sort of victory lap every November during tax levy meetings. It's a beautiful thing. So getting back to the third runway, again, they had 4 times 400% cost overruns and tons of scandals. But you could see the stress points of using that tax levy money to defray those costs. And you could see a certain amount of mutiny from airlines, indicated by Alaska objecting to Southwest wanting to move even a few flights. By the way, Southwest wanted to move flights over, and this can't be said often enough, because service levels were poor. By keeping that cost of employment up a little bit and everything, you do not hear that kind of discontent from the airlines. And so even for all of this capital spending on the SAMP and on the International Arrivals Facility a few years ago, they've already budgeted in that $5.5 billion, even though it's 20 times larger than the original cost of the third runway. All of that spending has been priced in. And that alone should tell you that they're doing pretty good. Could there be some speed bumps? For sure. You look at the International Arrivals Facility, that would have provoked serious concerns back in the day over the permitting process and huge cost overruns. Not to mention, by the way, that when it was built, somebody didn't follow the plans and it couldn't accommodate the jumbo jets that it was designed to, so they had to put another $100 million into redoing it. It's been in the papers, but you don't see a whole bunch of outrage about it. even $100 million is like, so what, right? That should give you a sense of how much better managed the airport is. Well, at least the PR. Something that big would have gotten serious attention, both from the state and local governments a while ago, and now it's a blip. Until recently, nobody was talking about overruns on the SAMP. But in a recent press release, the port has started to telegraph that there could be overruns as much as 2x. I guess meaning going from 5.5 to 10, 11. Okay, well, if they're telling you that it's a possibility now, they're also telling you that it's, probably going to happen. Huge construction cost overruns seem to be, just standard operating procedure. But based on how unpleasant things were with the third runway, even then, you can tell that they'll just work it out with the airlines. It will simply be a very unhappy, grumbly negotiation, and a few people will pay a few more bucks, more than likely the passengers, and the port may draw down a bit of money from those passenger facility charges, but, everything will end up copacetic because it's too big to fail. Oh, and going back to, people saying they're concerned, we talked about the tree cutting thing last week. It's a funny thing about that. The idea of the port using tax levy for community programs has a long history. It developed an ongoing ILA, interlocal agreement with the city of Sea-Tac, and now they pay $1.4 million a year out of the tax levy for public safety. It's really just kind of a general community relief thing, but that's also something you could use a tax levy for. And it's funny because whenever other groups go and talk about community relief, the port will argue that there's this thing in the state constitution, Article 8, which says that the port is only authorized to provide these kinds of grants for things like economic development, tourism, and sound insulation. So the reason the various little community grant programs that people get for trees and stuff, they'll be limited to $10,000, $15,000 because that's the only thing that will pass constitutional muster. You really have to wonder what's real about all this. Somehow the city of Sea-Tac is able to work around this constitutional thing. Cities get $30,000 with a 2-to-1 match, and then nonprofits might get $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, which may or may not sound like a lot to you, but if you get $15,000 and you need a 2 or even 3-to-1 volunteer match, that means you've got to come up with $45,000 in volunteer money. And we're like, well, great, just hire 2 lawyers for a day. That's the lawyer joke for the week. So last week, the commission renamed the grant program yet again to South King County and Port Impact Fund, and it just is an acknowledgement of how far the programs have drifted from the original intent we talked about last week. It's always been these large numbers. Now it's 14, but they end up drifting towards, economic development grants, and even cities are only eligible for $30,000, well, except for Sea-Tac, which is also a funny thing because cities are the most efficient way to address those kinds of things. And forward referencing, we're going to do an episode on all of this grant stuff. But the only thing that's important for now is that, there's $14 million in the budget right now, and very little of it has ever gone to address airport impacts. You've heard about those charities. You hear about their efficiency percentage where, some charities only take 3 cents for administrative costs. Yeah, that's not the Port of Seattle. We keep coming back to this concept of highly perverse incentives. Think about a company that offers $1 million in coupons. You wonder how can they do that, and in that case, they know that only 15% of people will go through all of the rubbish of filling out forms and sending them back and putting on a stamp. A grant program with high administrative costs and onerous requirements is like that. You can already predict that you're going to get a low bang for buck. Regardless of intent, that is the net effect. You get 100% PR value at a highly discounted price. So we're touched that, you're worried, but you worry too much. A reasonable ask from cities might be, great, let's take that $14 million from the tax levy and give it to cities directly for airport impacts. Boom. Because they know what their residents need and how to allocate that money for close to 100% efficiency. And here's the punchline. It's going to happen whether the 5.5 billion does this thing, or the COVID does the other thing, or the tariffs do the yada yada over here. It's already built in to the system year in and year out, regardless of anything else. It is independent, completely independent of any of the rest of the port's debt service. And the beautiful part, you, my friend, are already paying for it. You're just paying yourself. Well, you would be if they, The only impediment we see is the constant grousing from the port concerning that constitutional limit. And that is what we mean by RCW 53. RCW 53 is the part of the state code that created port districts, including the Port of Seattle, and has that little bit of language that makes it supposedly challenging to provide easy grant programs, especially for cities. Every year, we are asked to join with the port in supporting their shared agenda along with start cities, to really work together as a team, and yet simply making it easier to spend that money that they have already allocated for community grants has never entered into the equation. A guiding principle of the port's century agenda is to be the greenest airport in America, providing the most efficient value for tax dollars to obtain airport community relief should be a top priority that we all share. The only question is, will we and the port lock arms, go to Olympia, and say, this system is inefficient. We would like the legislature to take the money that we already want to spend to help airport communities and get to that 97% efficiency, like the best possible grant givers out there. It just occurred to me, who is a model of grant giving efficiency? Why, it's the FAA, Safety and Efficiency. The PFC program, Passenger Facilities Charges, which the airport collects out of every ticket we saw and can use for capital projects, but not community relief. Well, that's right in there at about a 4% administrative burden. So come on, Port of Seattle. We think you can do at least as well as those guys.